Scarlett tightened her grip on the house keys as she stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the letter in her trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should, each word sinking into her chest like a lead weight. Your property has been sold at auction. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The words blurred before her eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the realization crashed over her. Her grandmother's home, the only real piece of family history she had left, was gone. But she hadn't sold it. She hadn't agreed to anything. This was a mistake. It had to be. The air felt thick, suffocating, as she dropped the letter onto the kitchen table, her fingers trembling as she snatched her phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the page. Each ring felt like a lifetime, and when a clipped, indifferent voice finally answered, Scarlett forced herself to stay calm. She explained, no, pleaded, for an explanation, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. The man on the other end barely seemed to listen before responding in a tone dripping with indifference. The sale is final. You'll have to take it up with the Homeowners Association. Scarlett's stomach twisted into knots. Homeowners Association? There had to be a mistake. Her grandmother had always been adamant about never joining the HOA when it was formed in the neighborhood years ago. It was a source of pride for her. Freedom from arbitrary rules and unnecessary fees. But the man on the phone didn't care about that. That's not my problem, Mississippi. You'll need to resolve it with them. As far as we're concerned, the property is no longer yours. The line went dead before she could argue. For a long moment, Scarlett just stood there, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced. The house was everything to her. It wasn't just walls and floors. It was her grandmother's legacy, filled with childhood memories of warm cookies baking in the kitchen, bedtime stories on the old porch swing, and quiet laughter over steaming cups of tea. The idea of strangers stripping it down, gutting it for profit, made her stomach churn. How could this happen? How could her home be taken from her, without so much as a warning? She tore through the kitchen drawers, digging for anything that might explain what was going on. Bills, property records, insurance statements. Everything pointed to her as the rightful owner. There was nothing about an HOA, no missed payments, no foreclosure notices. It didn't make sense. Her fingers finally landed on the thick envelope containing her grandmother's will, her heart pounding as she flipped through the pages. Everything had been transferred to her name legally. There was no loophole, no fine print that should have allowed anyone to take it away from her. Determination burned in her chest as she grabbed her car keys. If the HOA had answers, she was going to get them. Now, the drive to the HOA office felt like a blur. Scarlett's hands tightened around the steering wheel, her mind replaying the conversation over and over. If her grandmother had never joined, then how did they claim the right to sell the house? And why hadn't she received any notice? The office was nestled between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner in a small strip mall, its bland beige sign doing little to mask the growing sense of dread in her gut. She pushed through the glass doors, her jaw set, her heart hammering. A woman at the front desk barely looked up as Scarlett approached, her fingers clacking away at a keyboard. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, not bothering to disguise the boredom in her voice. "No," Scarlett said, forcing her voice to stay even. "But I need to speak to someone immediately about my house. It was sold at auction, and I don't understand why." The receptionist let out an exaggerated sigh before disappearing into the back. Scarlett crossed her arms, her pulse quickening as she took in the pristine, soulless decor of the office. Framed certificates, crisp white walls, a faint scent of air freshener that did little to mask the staleness of the place. A few minutes later, a tall man in a tailored suit emerged, his smile so carefully practiced it felt more like a threat than a greeting. "Miss Green, I presume?" Scarlett's stomach turned at the sound of her last name coming from his mouth. It was the way he said it, like she was a problem he had already solved. "Yes. I want to know why my house was sold when my grandmother was never part of this association." The man, Richard Carlisle, according to the nameplate on his desk, gestured toward a small conference room. "Let's discuss this privately." Scarlett followed, her hands clenched at her sides as she sat across from him. He folded his hands, looking at her with the cool indifference of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "I understand this is a stressful time for you," he said, his voice laced with feigned sympathy. "But all properties in this neighborhood are automatically part of the HOA now. Your grandmother may have opted out decades ago, but our bylaws were updated 2 years ago to include all residences. When she passed, the responsibility of paying dues transferred to you." Scarlett felt the blood drain from her face. "But I was never informed about any of this. No letters, no calls, nothing." Carlisle shrugged. "Not our responsibility to track down new owners. We followed protocol. Notices were sent to the address on file. The address on file was my grandmother's. She was deceased. You knew that." His lips curled into something that almost resembled a smile. "I'm afraid that's irrelevant now. The property has already been sold." Scarlett's breath hitched. "You stole my house." Carlisle chuckled, shaking his head. "Miss Green, let's be clear. You didn't pay your dues. The board acted in accordance with our rights under state law. If you feel otherwise, you're welcome to seek legal counsel." Scarlett's hands trembled as she stood, gripping the back of the chair for support. She had never felt so powerless, so utterly blindsided. The home she had planned to restore, to fill with new memories, had been taken from her in the most underhanded way possible, and they were confident she wouldn't fight back. Richard Carlisle was already reaching for a folder on his desk, dismissing her like an afterthought. "If there's nothing else." Scarlett turned on her heel and stormed out, her heart pounding in her ears. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Scarlett barely remembered the drive home. The rage inside her burned hotter with every turn of the wheel, every red light that forced her to stop and think about what had just happened. The smugness in Richard Carlisle's voice echoed in her head. The way he had dismissed her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience, as if her loss was just another routine transaction for him. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. How could they do this? How could they take something that was never theirs to claim? Her grandmother had opted out. She had seen the papers. The house was hers, legally and rightfully. And now they were telling her that none of it mattered because of some rule they had decided to change without informing her. The injustice of it all made her stomach churn. This wasn't just about a house. It was about them believing they could trample over her because she was young, because she didn't have the resources or the power to fight back. But they were wrong. She parked in front of the house, her house, staring at it as if it were already slipping away from her. The porch, with its chipped paint and creaky steps, the front door she had unlocked 1,000 times before, the windows that had once glowed warmly in the evenings when her grandmother sat inside reading, all of it now tainted by the thought that someone else was planning to rip it away from her. The idea of a stranger walking through those halls, gutting the place to make it marketable, made her sick. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her phone and sat at the kitchen table, flipping open the folders she had brought back from her grandmother's office. There had to be something here, something they had missed. She pulled out the opt-out document again, running her fingers over the faded ink. It was real, legally binding. The HOA had no right to impose their fees on her, no right to claim ownership over a property that had never been theirs. She needed proof, more proof, something concrete that would force them to back down. Logging into her laptop, she started searching for public records, anything that might show the history of the HOA's agreements in the neighborhood. It took her hours, digging through old legal documents, reading through meeting notes from HOA board discussions she found archived online. And then she saw it. 2 years ago, the board had voted to amend their bylaws, quietly eliminating the ability for homeowners to opt out. No major announcements, no letters sent out. Just a change buried in the fine print of a board meeting's minutes. But there was something else. The record showed that shortly after the change, several older properties, including her grandmother's, were marked with automatic inclusion due to historical irregularities. The phrase meant nothing legally, but it was clear what they had done. They had targeted properties like hers, knowing the owners were elderly or had recently passed, counting on the fact that their heirs wouldn't know the history or the legal loopholes that had protected them before. Scarlett's stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. It was calculated. They had waited for her grandmother to pass, then swooped in, knowing she wouldn't have been aware of the sudden rule change. And now they were acting as if it was all just a matter of process, as if she had been negligent when they had orchestrated this from the beginning. Her hands shook as she clicked through more records. There had to be others. If they had done this to her, there were probably more victims. Other families who had lost their homes without even knowing what was happening. Her breath caught when she found another case from last year. An elderly man had fought the HOA when they foreclosed on his house, claiming his late wife had opted out years ago. He had lost. The court had ruled that the revised bylaws overrode the previous agreements, and he had been forced to leave the home he had lived in for 40 years. Scarlett slammed the laptop shut, her pulse racing. If it had happened before, then they had precedent. Fighting this was going to be nearly impossible. The legal system had already sided with the HOA once. What chance did she have? The weight of it all pressed down on her, suffocating, threatening to crush any hope she had left. But then she thought of her grandmother, the way she had always stood her ground, the way she had refused to be bullied into doing something she didn't believe in. That fire wasn't gone, and Scarlett wasn't about to roll over and let them take what was hers without a fight. Her first step was to find out just how deep this corruption ran. She needed witnesses, people who had been in the neighborhood long enough to remember how things used to be. The next morning, she made her way to the home of the Johnsons, an elderly couple who had been close friends with her grandmother. When they opened the door, they were surprised to see her, but as soon as she explained what had happened, Mrs. Johnson's face darkened. Margaret was always proud that she opted out of that nonsense, she said, shaking her head. She used to say she didn't need some group of busybodies telling her how to take care of her own home. Mr. Johnson frowned, rubbing his chin. We opted out too, back when they first tried to bring everyone in. But over the years, they kept coming back, trying to push us into joining. We held out as long as we could, but eventually, they made it impossible. We gave in a few years ago, after they started threatening to fine us for ridiculous things like mailbox height and lawn maintenance. Scarlett's chest tightened. So this was their pattern, applying pressure, making it impossible to say no. Her grandmother had resisted to the very end, but once she was gone, they had pounced. She asked if they had any old paperwork, anything that might show how the HOA had operated in the past. Mrs. Johnson disappeared into the house and returned a few minutes later with a box of old documents. As Scarlett sifted through them, she found what she was looking for, a copy of an old HOA newsletter from when the organization was first established. It listed the original opt-out clause in clear terms, signed and acknowledged by the founding board members. More importantly, it included a note that any changes to membership status had to be agreed upon by the property owner at the time. That meant her grandmother's opt-out should have still been valid. Scarlett felt a rush of determination. This was it. This was the proof she needed to show that what they had done was illegal. She thanked the Johnsons and left, gripping the document tightly. But as she walked back to her car, she knew this wasn't enough. The HOA had already shown they were willing to bend the rules in their favor. If she wanted to win, she needed something more. She needed legal backup, and she had no idea where to find it. Scarlett sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of documents in front of her, feeling the weight of everything she had uncovered pressing down on her chest. The opt-out agreement, the old HOA newsletters, the records showing how they had systematically stripped people of their rights without them realizing. It was all here, proof that what they had done was intentional, calculated, and outright predatory. But proof meant nothing if she didn't have the means to fight back. Her bank account barely had enough to cover her tuition and groceries, let alone the cost of hiring a lawyer to go up against a well-funded HOA and the real estate investment company that had bought her house. The thought made her stomach churn. They were banking on that fact, weren't they? That she was young, that she didn't have money, that she wouldn't have the resources to push back, that she would just accept the loss and walk away. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. This was her home. She wasn't going to let them take it without a fight. She spent the next few hours researching lawyers, scrolling through websites filled with legal jargon and consultation fees that made her want to slam the laptop shut in frustration. Every firm she called either asked for an outrageous retainer up front or dismissed her case as unwinnable. The HOA as precedent, one receptionist told her flatly before hanging up. Another lawyer she spoke with seemed mildly interested until she mentioned that she had no money to pay him. "Sorry, kid," he had said. "I don't work for free." The hopelessness clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to push forward. There had to be another way. That evening, she came across something promising. A local legal aid organization that specialized in helping people fight wrongful evictions and property disputes. They offered free consultations for low-income individuals, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Scarlett felt a sliver of hope. She called the number immediately, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. A woman answered, her voice calm and professional. Scarlett explained her situation in rushed, desperate sentences, waiting for the inevitable rejection. But instead, the woman on the other end listened patiently, asking questions that made it clear she understood exactly what Scarlett was up against. "This sounds like something we can help with," she finally said. "Can you come in for a consultation next week?" Scarlett nearly sagged in relief as she agreed to the appointment. With one battle set in motion, she turned her attention to another, exposing the HOA for what they had done. She needed more than just legal documents. She needed people who had been affected, people who could back up her claims and show that this wasn't just about one house. She spent the next few days knocking on doors, talking to her grandmother's old neighbors, piecing together a pattern that was even worse than she had imagined. The Johnsons had been pressured into joining the HOA under threat of excessive fines. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Dawson, told her that he had nearly lost his home the same way she had, but had been able to pay off the supposed unpaid dues just in time. He had never received a clear answer about why he suddenly owed thousands of dollars to an association he had never agreed to join. The more Scarlett dug, the angrier she became. This wasn't an accident. This was a business model. The HOA was preying on homeowners, forcing them into compliance through intimidation, and then seizing their properties when they were at their most vulnerable. Armed with new testimonies and a growing sense of determination, Scarlett met with the legal aid attorney Amber Grant at the organization's small office downtown. Amber was a woman in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and confident, the kind of person who seemed to instantly recognize the fight in Scarlett and match it with her own. She listened intently as Scarlett laid out everything: the sudden foreclosure, the opt-out agreement, the predatory nature of the HOA's rule changes. Amber took notes, occasionally nodding, her face unreadable until Scarlett finally finished speaking. Then, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "This is bad," she said, "but not in the way you think. It's bad for them, because they got sloppy." Scarlett's pulse quickened as Amber flipped through the stack of documents, her eyes narrowing at the HOA meeting minutes Scarlett had found. "They changed the bylaws without notifying property owners," Amber continued. "That's a violation of procedural law. And they failed to properly notify you of the lien before moving to foreclosure, which means the entire process is legally questionable at best, outright fraudulent at worst." Scarlett sat up straighter. "So, we can fight this?" Amber gave her a small, determined smile. "Not only can we fight it, but we can win over the next few weeks." They built their case. Amber filed an official challenge to the foreclosure and sale, demanding a reversal of the transaction and an investigation into the HOA's practices. She also filed a request for discovery, forcing the HOA to turn over internal records related to the foreclosure process. Meanwhile, Scarlett kept digging, documenting every interaction she had with the HOA, taking pictures of the for sale sign that had appeared on her lawn as if her home was already lost. One afternoon, she returned home to find a contractor walking around her property, taking measurements for renovations the investment company had already planned. The sight made her blood boil. They were acting like they had already won, like she was just a temporary inconvenience they could brush aside. But she was going to prove them wrong. Then the breakthrough came. Through a public records request, Amber obtained emails between HOA board members that confirmed what Scarlett had suspected all along. This had been deliberate. One email from Richard Carlisle himself, sent just days after her grandmother's passing, stated, "The Green property is now vulnerable. No heirs with financial backing. Push through foreclosure before they realize what's happening." Another board member had responded with a single sentence that made Scarlett's hands shake as she read it. "She's too young to fight this." That was all they needed. The HOA hadn't just failed to notify her. They had counted on her being too inexperienced to stop them. They had orchestrated everything, banking on her ignorance and lack of resources. But they had underestimated her, because now she had everything she needed to take them down. The legal battle was only beginning, but Scarlett no longer felt like she was fighting alone. She had Amber. She had the neighbors who were now speaking up, emboldened by her refusal to back down. And most of all, she had the undeniable truth on her side. The HOA had stolen from her, and she was going to make sure they paid for it. Scarlett sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, her hands clenched together in her lap. Months of sleepless nights of frustration, of digging through old files and chasing leads, had led her to this moment. The courtroom was cold, the fluorescent lighting casting a stark glow over the polished wood and the faces of those who had tried to ruin her life. Richard Carlisle sat across from her, his smug expression now replaced with something far more uncertain. The lawyer representing the real estate investment company sat beside him, adjusting his tie, his face unreadable. Scarlett exhaled slowly, glancing to her left where Amber sat beside her, calm, focused, flipping through a stack of neatly organized files. This was it. This was where everything would be decided. Either she would walk out of here knowing she had fought and won, or she would lose everything. The judge entered, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority that immediately silenced the room. Scarlett swallowed as everyone stood, then sat again as the proceedings began. The HOA's lawyer wasted no time painting Scarlett as an irresponsible young woman who had failed to meet her financial obligations, insisting that the foreclosure was justified. He cited the revised bylaws, the supposed notices they had sent, and their legal right to claim the property when she had failed to pay. Scarlett's stomach twisted as she listened, but she kept her face neutral. This was the story they had constructed, the same one they had used to intimidate others into silence. But she wasn't going to stay silent. Not now. Amber stood, her voice steady and firm, as she began dismantling their argument piece by piece. She presented the opt-out document signed by Scarlett's grandmother, explaining how it had been legally binding and should have exempted the property from the HOA's reach. She pointed out that the bylaw changes had been made without proper notification to affected homeowners, rendering them legally questionable. Then she produced the email records, messages between Carlisle and other board members discussing their plan to target Scarlett, their assumption that she was too young to understand what was happening, their outright decision to push the foreclosure through before she could fight back. The courtroom was silent as the emails were read aloud, each line making it clearer and clearer that this hadn't been an accident. It had been a calculated move, a predatory decision made by people who thought they could get away with it. Carlisle shifted in his seat, his previously composed demeanor cracking for the first time. His lawyer objected, claiming the emails had been taken out of context, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "This is extremely concerning," she said, her gaze locking onto Carlisle. Are you telling me that you knowingly proceeded with a foreclosure while deliberately withholding information from the legal heir? Carlyle opened his mouth, but no words came out. The lawyer beside him quickly interjected, trying to spin the situation, but the damage had already been done. The judge then turned her attention to the real estate investment company's lawyer, who had been sitting quietly, watching the destruction unfold. Your company was aware of the pending dispute over this property, and yet you still moved forward with renovations, correct? The lawyer cleared his throat. We acted in good faith, Your Honor. We were not aware of any wrongdoing on the part of the HOA. Amber leaned forward. Then why did your company refuse to halt renovations after being formally notified of a legal dispute? She slid a printed email across the table. Another damning piece of evidence. Your client was informed of our legal challenge weeks ago, yet still proceeded as though they had clear ownership. The judge took a long pause before speaking again, her voice even but carrying a weight that filled the room. This case presents a disturbing pattern of behavior that suggests not only negligence, but intentional deception on the part of the HOA. She flipped through her notes, then met Scarlett's gaze. The foreclosure process is hereby deemed invalid. The title will be restored to Miss Green immediately. Scarlett barely registered the sound of murmurs rippling through the courtroom as relief crashed over her, making her dizzy. She clutched the edge of the table, hardly believing what she had just heard. But the judge wasn't done. She turned back to Carlyle, her expression colder now. Furthermore, given the nature of this deception and the apparent targeting of vulnerable homeowners, the court is imposing financial penalties on the HOA for damages. Miss Green will also be reimbursed for any legal fees incurred in this process. Carlyle's face was a shade paler now, his lips pressed into a tight line as the weight of what had just happened settled on him. The real estate company's lawyers stood, already trying to mitigate the fallout, insisting that their client had acted within legal parameters. But the judge had made her decision. Scarlett exhaled a shaky breath as the final verdict was announced. She had won. She had actually won. It felt surreal, like a dream she was going to wake up from at any moment. She turned to Amber, who gave her a small, satisfied nod. "Told you we had them," she murmured. When the hearing was officially adjourned, Scarlett stood, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her as she made her way out of the courtroom. The moment she stepped into the hallway, the tension in her body finally cracked, and she let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for months. Amber patted her shoulder. "You did it," she said. "They won't be able to pull this off again. Not after today." The days that followed were a whirlwind. The HOA board faced serious scrutiny, and within a week, Carlyle resigned under pressure. Residents who had once been afraid to challenge them were coming forward with their own stories, demanding justice for what had been done to them. The real estate investment company pulled out of the deal, cutting their losses, and just like that, Scarlett's house was fully hers again. The locks had never felt more secure when she turned her own key in the front door, stepping inside with the knowledge that no one could take this from her again. She stood in the living room, looking around at the familiar space, the echoes of her grandmother's presence still lingering in every corner. She had fought for this house, fought for her home, and she had won. It wasn't just about keeping a building. It was about proving that they couldn't walk over her, that they couldn't exploit people and expect no consequences. They had underestimated her, and they had paid the price. As she sank onto the old couch, exhaustion finally catching up with her, she allowed herself a small, tired smile. She had no idea what came next, but for now, she was exactly where she was meant to be,